The number sat on the page like it was daring me to react. $9,800,000. $9.8 million. Typed cleanly, neatly, legally. And my father wanted my signature under it. "Go ahead," he said, tapping the bottom of the document with a manicured finger. "Sign it." We were seated in a conference room that smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive coffee. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, glass and steel and power. The kind of room where decisions were made that never seemed to affect people like me. Until now. The lawyer cleared his throat nervously. He kept glancing between my father and me, like he was watching a slow-moving car accident and couldn't look away. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I didn't ask why, because I already knew. My father had always been very clear about one thing. Everything he built belonged to him, not the family, not the legacy, not the bloodline. Him. He liked to say it casually at dinner parties, at family gatherings, even when I was a kid. "I don't believe in entitlement," he'd say, swirling his wine. "People earn what they get." Everyone would nod approvingly, and I would sit there quietly, absorbing the message early. Love in this family was conditional, security was earned, and questioning authority came at a cost. So when he called me that morning and said, "Be at Harrison and Cole at 10, bring ID," I didn't ask questions. I'd learned not to. "Sign it," he repeated now, impatience sharpening his tone. "We don't have all day." I finally looked up from the document and met his eyes. They were cold, focused, certain. This wasn't a discussion, it was an order. "What happens if I don't?" I asked, calmly. His jaw tightened. "You don't want to find out," he said. The lawyer shifted in his seat. I glanced back down at the paperwork. The heading read, "Voluntary Relinquishment of Beneficial Interest." Such polite words for theft. "You're signing away your claim," his father continued, as if explaining something trivial. "It simplifies things, avoids complications later." "Later when?" I asked. "When I decide how my estate is handled," he replied, sharply. "This is just housekeeping." Housekeeping. That's what he called erasing me.
The truth was, this wasn't sudden. This moment had been coming for years. Ever since my mother died, that was when things changed. Not immediately, slowly, like water eroding stone. After her funeral, my father became efficient, businesslike. Grief, to him, was something you processed privately and quickly. Emotions were inconveniences, attachments were liabilities. I was 26 then, old enough to be useful, young enough to still be controlled. At first, it was small things. He stopped including me in meetings, stopped sharing financial updates, stopped asking my opinion. Then came the suggestions. "You should move out," he said one night over dinner. "Independence builds character." I moved out. "You should sell the condo your mother left you," he advised later. "The market's good. I'll help you reinvest." I sold it. "You should let me manage that trust," he said. "You're busy. I know what I'm doing." I hesitated. He smiled. "Don't you trust me?" I handed it over. That was my first mistake, trusting that blood meant protection. Now here we were, a decade later, and he wanted everything else. "You're being dramatic," he said when I didn't immediately respond. "This is standard." "Standard for who?" I asked. "For families with assets," he snapped. I looked at the lawyer. "Is this standard?" The lawyer swallowed. "Well," he said carefully, "it's not uncommon, but—" "But what?" my father cut in. "But typically," the lawyer continued, voice cautious, "all parties are encouraged to seek independent counsel before signing." My father's eyes flashed. "That won't be necessary." I smiled, not because I was amused, because I was suddenly very, very clear. I'd spent years shrinking myself to fit into his world. Years telling myself I was lucky, privileged, ungrateful to question anything. But sitting there, staring at that number, something shifted. Not anger, not fear, resolve. I slid the document slightly away from me. "I have a question," I said lightly. My father exhaled sharply. "This isn't the time." "I want to ask the lawyer," I continued. The lawyer looked relieved for the interruption. "Yes," he said. I turned to him fully. "If I sign this," I asked calmly, "am I relinquishing rights to current assets only, or also to any proceeds from transactions already completed under my name?" The room went very still. My father froze. The lawyer blinked. "That would include proceeds from any assets previously held or transferred. Yes." I nodded slowly. "And does that include the offshore holding company?" I asked. "The one listed under the subsidiary trust established 12 years ago?" The lawyer's face went pale. My father stood up abruptly. "That's enough," he snapped. But it was already too late. The lawyer looked between us. "Miss, how do you know about that?" he asked carefully. I smiled again. This time it was genuine. "Because my mother was smarter than my father realized," I said. My father's voice dropped dangerously low. "You have no idea what you're talking about." I tilted my head. "Then you won't mind if I ask another question." He slammed his hand on the table. "This meeting is over." I didn't move. I looked at the lawyer. "One more thing," I said softly. "Before I sign anything, could you please confirm who the current beneficial owner of the Meridian Holdings account is?" The lawyer hesitated, then slowly turned the folder around and read the name out loud. Mine. The silence that followed was deafening. My father stared at the document like it had betrayed him, his face drained of color. For the first time in my life, he looked unsure. I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands, and smiled. Because now he understood something he never expected. He didn't have all the power, and the question I was about to ask next would change everything he thought he controlled. No one spoke for several seconds. Not my father, not the lawyer, not the assistant frozen by the door with a legal pad clutched to her chest. The city outside the window kept moving, cars threading through traffic, people crossing streets, a helicopter crossing somewhere above. But inside that conference room, time stalled. My father was the first to recover. He let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "That's not possible." The lawyer didn't laugh. He adjusted his glasses and looked back down at the document, flipping pages with slow, deliberate movements. His fingers trembled slightly. "It's unusual," he said carefully, "but according to the trust structure and subsequent amendments, Meridian Holdings lists your daughter as the sole beneficial owner." My father's face hardened. "That trust was temporary," he snapped. "It was a placeholder. A placeholder still has legal standing, and unless amended properly, which I'm not seeing here, it remains valid." I watched my father's expression shift through something I'd never seen before. Confusion, then calculation, then anger. "You went behind my back," he said to me quietly. I raised an eyebrow. "You mean my mother did?" His jaw clenched. "She wouldn't have." "She did," I said evenly. 12 years ago, right after you tried to restructure the estate without telling her." The lawyer looked up sharply. "You knew about that?" I nodded. "She told me everything." That wasn't entirely true. She'd told me enough.
My mother had never confronted my father directly. That wasn't her way. She played the long game. While he was busy building empires and dominating boardrooms, she was quietly reading documents, asking questions, and planning contingencies. She knew you'd try to consolidate everything under your control, so she made sure one asset you couldn't touch wasn't yours. My father laughed again, but this time there was no humor at all. "You think this gives you leverage," he said. "You think one account changes anything?" I smiled faintly. "I think it explains why you're suddenly so eager for my signature." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale, if I may." "Not now," my father snapped. I leaned forward slightly. "Actually, now would be a great time." He shot me a glare sharp enough to cut glass. "I want to understand something," I continued calmly. "Why the rush?" He said nothing. "Why now?" I pressed. "Why not wait? Why call me in without warning and demand I sign away nearly $10 million? The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. My father's silence was answer enough.
But I wanted it spoken. "Is Meridian being audited?" I asked. The lawyer's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. My father's eyes snapped to him. "Did you tell her?" he demanded. The lawyer swallowed. "No, I didn't need him to," I said. "I read the notices." My father stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long have I known?" I replied. "Long enough." The truth was, I hadn't planned this moment. I hadn't walked into that conference room with a strategy. I'd walked in prepared to be erased. But something strange happens when someone underestimates you for too long. Eventually, their blind spots become your advantage. "You're making a mistake," my father said, voice low and controlled now. "This isn't a game." "I agree, which is why I'm not signing anything today." The lawyer looked visibly relieved. "That would be advisable," he said quickly. "Given the complexity here, I strongly recommend independent counsel for both parties." My father shot him a murderous look. "Fine," he said tightly. "We'll reconvene." He turned to me. "Alone." "I don't think so." His eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "You ordered me here," I said calmly. "You tried to pressure me into signing away assets without disclosure. This conversation doesn't get to happen behind closed doors." For a moment, I thought he might shout. Instead, he smiled. The kind of smile that closed deals and ruined people. "You've always been naive," he said softly. "This world will eat you alive." I returned his smile. "You taught me that," I replied. "I just paid attention." The meeting ended abruptly. My father stormed out without another word. The lawyer remained seated, staring at the table like it might open up and swallow him. "I'm sorry," he said quietly once the door closed. "I had no idea." I gathered my bag. "You did exactly what you were hired to do." He hesitated. "If you don't mind me asking, what are you going to do?" I paused. "I'm going to ask one more question." He looked confused. "Just not today." By the time I reached the elevator, my phone was already vibrating. My father. I didn't answer. Then a text. "You don't understand what you're risking." I typed back 3 words. "Neither did you." That night, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid, because my entire understanding of my family had shifted. The man I'd spent my life trying to appease wasn't omnipotent. He was scrambling. And the woman I'd thought stayed silent to keep the peace, she'd been building a shield I didn't know I'd need. The next morning, I met with my own lawyer, a woman recommended quietly, discreetly. She listened without interrupting as I laid everything out. When I finished, she leaned back and exhaled slowly. "Your father tried to force an invalid relinquishment," she said. "That alone is concerning." "And Meridian?" I asked. She smiled. "That's the interesting part."
She explained what my father hadn't wanted me to know. The account wasn't just valuable, it was pivotal, collateral, leverage. And if I signed that document, I wouldn't just lose money, I'd lose protection. Your mother was very strategic, my lawyer continued. She structured this so control couldn't be transferred without your explicit consent. I swallowed. So why didn't she tell me everything? I asked. My lawyer tilted her head. Because she knew your father. I understood immediately. If I'd known earlier, I might have confronted him, warned him, given him time to maneuver. My mother had trusted time more than confrontation. That afternoon, my father showed up unannounced. At my apartment, I didn't invite him in. He stood in the hallway, impeccably dressed, fury barely contained. "You think you've won," he said. "I think you miscalculated," I replied. "You owe me," he snapped. "Everything you have exists because of me." I met his gaze steadily. "No," I said. "Everything you built exists because you took credit for what others helped you create." His eyes darkened. "This isn't over," he said. I nodded. "I know." He turned to leave, then paused. "What did you want to ask the lawyer?" he asked over his shoulder. I smiled. "I wanted to ask," I said calmly, "what happens if the beneficiary refuses and reports coercion?" He didn't look back, but his shoulders stiffened, and for the first time in my life, I watched my father walk away without the last word. I didn't know how far he'd go next. I didn't know what he'd try, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The next move was his, and whatever he did, he would finally have to do it knowing I wasn't powerless anymore. The first thing I learned after that meeting was how quickly power reveals itself when it feels threatened. Within 48 hours, my father's name appeared in places it hadn't before. Emails forwarded by accident, calls that dropped halfway through, acquaintances suddenly eager to check in. People who'd never spoken to me directly were now testing the waters, trying to figure out which version of the story would survive. Because my father wasn't just a man with money, he was a man with reach, and men like that don't lose quietly. My lawyer warned me immediately. "He's going to apply pressure," she said during our second meeting. "Not legally at first. Socially, emotionally. He'll try to destabilize you." "How?" I asked. She gave me a knowing look. "By reminding you who he's always been to everyone else." I understood. My father had spent decades curating his image. Philanthropist, visionary, family man. The kind of person whose name opened doors and closed conversations. If he couldn't control the assets, he'd tried to control the narrative. The first call came from my uncle, my father's younger brother, loyal, indebted. "You're causing a lot of unnecessary tension," he said without greeting. "Your dad's under stress." I smiled faintly. "He put himself there." "He built everything you have," my uncle snapped. "This is gratitude?" "No," I replied calmly. "This is boundaries." He scoffed. "You're being manipulated." "Yes," I said, "just not by who you think." The line went dead. Then came the emails. Old family friends, business partners, even a former professor who'd once praised my father publicly. Each message followed the same pattern: concern masked as curiosity, advice disguised as warning, subtle reminders of who held influence. "You don't want to burn bridges." "Your father has always spoken highly of you." "This could get messy." They weren't wrong. It was already messy, just not in the way they meant. What none of them knew was that my father had already burned the bridge years ago, when he decided my consent was optional. 3 days later, my lawyer called me earlier than scheduled. "There's been a development," she said. My stomach tightened. "What kind?" "Your father filed a petition," she replied. "He's challenging the validity of the trust." I exhaled slowly. Of course he was. On paper, it was a reasonable move. Question intent, claim undue influence, argue incompetence. Classic. "He's asserting that your mother was pressured," my lawyer continued, "that you manipulated her." I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable. "She was dying," I said quietly. "She could barely lift a glass of water." "Yes," my lawyer said gently, which is why his argument won't hold, but it tells us something important. "What?" I asked. "He's desperate." That night, I sat alone in my apartment, lights off, city glowing outside my windows. I thought about my mother, about how she'd brush my hair when I was little, how she'd listen instead of instruct, how she'd watch my father dominate a room and say nothing, but later ask quiet questions that revealed she'd noticed everything. I used to think she stayed silent because she was afraid. Now I understood. She stayed silent because she was strategic, and she'd trusted me with the aftermath. The next confrontation came unexpectedly, at a charity event. I hadn't planned on going, but my name was on the invitation, and part of me knew avoiding public spaces would look like retreat, so I went, alone. The room buzzed with familiar faces, champagne, soft music, power dressed as elegance. And then I saw him. My father stood near the center, surrounded by admirers. When his eyes met mine, the room seemed to tilt. For a moment, no one moved. Then he smiled and walked toward me. "You look well," he said, voice smooth. "So do you," I replied. People leaned in subtly, pretending not to listen. Running around, asking questions, involving lawyers, making things complicated.
"You started this," I said evenly. He chuckled. "You think I didn't anticipate resistance?" "I think you underestimated me," I replied. His smile faltered, just slightly. "Careful," he said. "You're out of your depth." I met his gaze. "Then why are you trying so hard to pull me back under?" That one landed. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This doesn't end well for people who challenge me." I didn't step back. "It already didn't end well," I said, "for the version of me you controlled." Silence flickered between us. Then applause erupted nearby as someone took the stage. My father straightened his jacket. "We'll see how this plays out," he said. "Yes," I agreed. "We will." 2 days later, my lawyer sent me a document, an internal memo, accidentally included in a discovery packet. It outlined my father's financial exposure if Meridian Holdings stayed out of his control. Loans, guarantees, personal liabilities. The number made my stomach drop. He didn't just want my money, he needed it. Suddenly, everything made sense. The urgency, the pressure, the threats disguised as authority. This wasn't about dominance, it was about survival. And for the first time, I held something he couldn't afford to lose. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I prepared. We tightened security, locked down accounts, documented every interaction. Because power doesn't disappear when exposed, it adapts. The final call before everything changed came late one night. My father's number. I answered. "You've made your point," he said, voice low. "Let's be reasonable." I leaned against the counter, heart steady. "What does reasonable look like to you?" I asked. A pause. "Sign a revised agreement," he said. "We split control, quietly. No court, no scandal." "And if I don't?" I asked. Another pause. "Then this becomes very ugly." I smiled to myself. "You already tried ugly," I said. "Now try honest." He hung up. The next morning, my lawyer called. "She's escalating," she said. "Media inquiries, pressure on your accounts. We're ready, but you need to decide something."
What? I asked. She hesitated. How far are you willing to go? I looked out the window, sunlight breaking over the city. I thought about the girl who'd sold her inheritance because she trusted the wrong person, the woman who'd walked into a conference room prepared to disappear, and the daughter whose mother had quietly given her the final word. All the way, I said. And as I said it, I realized something profound. This fight was never about money. It was about who gets to decide my future. And for the first time in my life, that answer was me. Once I said all the way, there was no pretending this was just a family disagreement anymore. It became a war of posture. My father didn't come at me head-on. He was too experienced for that. Instead, he did what men like him always do when they realize brute force won't work. He tried to isolate me. The first move was subtle. My credit card company flagged unusual activity and temporarily froze one of my accounts, then another. Then a delay appeared in a wire transfer tied to Meridian Holdings. Nothing catastrophic, just enough friction to remind me how interconnected everything was. My lawyer was already on it. Paper cuts, she said. He wants you to be uncomfortable, distracted. I nodded. He wants me tired. Exactly. So we didn't react emotionally, we documented. Every call, every delay, every intermediary suddenly misplacing paperwork. Patterns emerge quickly when you stop excusing them. Then came the social pressure, refined, almost elegant. I was quietly removed from the board of a nonprofit I'd served on for 3 years. No explanation, just a polite email thanking me for my time. 2 speaking engagements were postponed indefinitely. A longtime client asked if everything was okay, their tone careful in that way people get when they've heard something but won't say what. My father wasn't attacking my money, he was attacking my credibility. Because credibility is what allows women like me to move freely without permission. I didn't confront him. That would have been the reaction he expected. Instead, I did something far more dangerous to his strategy. I expanded my circle. I reached out to people he didn't control. I leaned into relationships he'd always dismissed as irrelevant. I stopped assuming proximity to power mattered more than integrity, and something unexpected happened. People stepped forward, quietly, deliberately. A former executive who'd left my father's company under mutual agreement, an accountant who'd refused to sign off on something years earlier, a journalist who'd once pitched a story and been stonewalled. They didn't come with accusations, they came with context. And context is lethal to false narratives. One evening, I met with my lawyer and an investigator she trusted. He slid a folder across the table. We started looking at Meridian's role in some of your father's other ventures, he said, specifically how its existence has been represented. I flipped through the pages. There were inconsistencies, cross-collateralization issues, agreements that assumed control he didn't legally have. Is this bad? I asked. The investigator gave a thin smile. It's fragile. Fragile was a generous word. If Meridian stayed outside his reach, several of my father's financial structures could collapse under scrutiny, which explained everything. The next escalation came faster than I expected. I was served papers. At home, not discreetly. A courier knocked loudly, announced himself clearly, and handed me the envelope while my neighbors watched. Inside was a civil complaint, breach of fiduciary duty, interference, undue influence. It was aggressive, sloppy, angry. And that was my first real advantage, because my father never made emotional moves unless he was losing control. My lawyer read the filing and shook her head slowly. He's overreaching, she said. This won't hold. But, I asked. But he's forcing this into public record, she replied. That's a risk. For him. I smiled faintly. Then let him, I said. The hearing was scheduled quickly, too quickly. My father wanted momentum. He wanted to overwhelm. He wanted to remind me what it felt like to be the smaller presence in a big room.
I walked into the courthouse calm, composed, and completely uninterested in appeasing anyone. He avoided my gaze. That told me more than anything else could. In court, he painted himself as a concerned father, a man blindsided by betrayal, a widower protecting his legacy, a patriarch confused by a daughter's sudden defiance. It was a good performance. I almost admired it. Then my lawyer stood and dismantled it piece by piece. She presented the trust documents, the timelines, the internal communications, the coercive language in the relinquishment draft, and finally, the financial exposure. The judge leaned forward. My father shifted in his seat. For the first time, the room wasn't his. When the hearing adjourned, there was no ruling yet, but there was something far more dangerous to him: scrutiny. Reporters waited outside. Not many, but enough. I didn't speak. Neither did he, but his silence wasn't strength, it was containment. That night, my phone rang again. Unknown number. I answered. "You are enjoying this," my father said. "No," I replied honestly. "I'm enduring it." A pause. "You think you're different from me," he said. "You think you're better." "I think I'm done being managed," I replied. He laughed softly. "You don't win against someone like me." "I'm not trying to win," I said. "I'm trying to end this." "That's not how power works," he said. "Then you should be worried because you taught me how power works." He hung up. The days that followed were tense. Legal teams moved fast. Rumors spread faster. People who once avoided me now watched closely. And in the quiet moments, between emails, between strategy calls, I felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, anticipation. Because once the truth is in motion, it doesn't need permission to keep moving.
Then came the offer. Not from my father directly, from his attorney. A settlement proposal. Control retained by him, significant payout to me, strict confidentiality, enough money to disappear comfortably, enough silence to protect him. I read it slowly, then handed it back to my lawyer. "No," I said. She didn't argue. She'd already seen this coming. "What do you want?" she asked. I thought for a long moment. "Transparency," I said, "and independence." She nodded. "That's harder for him than losing money." I smiled. "Good." The final escalation came unexpectedly. Not in a courtroom, not through lawyers, at a dinner. One of those carefully curated events where deals are whispered and reputations are quietly reinforced. I hadn't planned on going, but I went anyway, because I was tired of avoiding rooms he'd claimed ownership of. When I walked in, conversations slowed. Eyes tracked me. Then I saw him, standing alone this time. No crowd, no buffer. He approached me slowly. "This ends tonight," he said quietly. "It already has," I replied. He shook his head. "You don't understand. Once this goes further, there's no undoing it." I met his gaze. "I understand perfectly," I said. "That's why I didn't sign." For a moment, the mask slipped. Not rage, fear. Then it was gone. "You were always too observant," he said. I smiled softly. "You underestimated that, too." As I left that night, I realized something important. This wasn't just about what my father stood to lose. It was about what I refused to give up anymore.
My voice, my autonomy, my future. The next phase wouldn't be quieter, it wouldn't be cleaner, but it would be definitive. Because the moment I stopped asking for permission, Everything he'd built on my silence started to crack. And the final reckoning? It was closer than either of us wanted to admit. The collapse didn't come with a single headline. It came in fragments, a filing here, a correction there, a name quietly removed from a board website, a deal that fell through without explanation. Power rarely shatters loudly, it erodes. And my father had spent decades convincing himself erosion only happened to other people. The ruling arrived on a gray Thursday morning. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just a PDF attachment from my lawyer with a subject line that read, "Preliminary Determination." I opened it alone at my kitchen table. The judge denied my father's petition, denied his claims of undue influence, denied his attempt to seize control of the trust, denied his motion to compel my signature. More importantly, the ruling formally recognized Meridian Holdings as independent, valid, and protected from unilateral interference. Mine. Fully. I sat there for a long time after reading it, not crying, not celebrating, just breathing. Because for the first time in my life, the ground beneath me felt solid. My father didn't call, he didn't text, he didn't send intermediaries. For days there was nothing, and that silence told me everything. When he finally did reach out, it wasn't with threats, it wasn't with demands, it was with something far more revealing: resignation. "We need to talk," he said quietly when I answered. "No lawyers," he added quickly, "just us." I considered it, then agreed, not because I owed him closure, but because I wanted it.
We met in a small private room at a restaurant he'd never chosen before. No stage, no audience, just two people sitting across from each other without an empire to hide behind. He looked older, not weaker, but exposed. "You didn't have to take it this far," he said after a while. I stirred my water slowly. "You didn't have to force my hand." He sighed. "You've made your point." I looked up. "You still think this was about proving something to you?" His eyes flickered. "What else would it be?" he asked. "This was about survival," I replied. "Mine." He leaned back, studying me. "For years," I continued, "you treated my consent as optional, my boundaries as inconveniences, my inheritance as leverage." "That's not," he began. "It is," I said calmly, "and you know it." Silence stretched between us, not hostile, uncomfortable. "You always wanted control," I said softly, "even over people you claimed to love." His jaw tightened. "That's how you protect what you build," he replied. "No," I said, "that's how you isolate it." That landed. He didn't apologize. Not fully, but he did something I never expected. He asked a question. "What happens now?" he said quietly. I met his gaze. "Now," I said, "we live separate lives." He frowned. "You're cutting me out?" "I'm stepping out," I replied. "There's a difference." He studied my face, like he was searching for hesitation. He didn't find any. "Meridian stays independent," I continued. "I don't interfere with your remaining assets. You don't interfere with mine." "And our relationship?" he asked. I paused. "That depends on whether you can treat me like a person, not a contingency plan." He exhaled slowly. "I don't know if I'm good at that," he admitted. "I know. That's why this boundary exists." When we stood to leave, he hesitated. "You're more like your mother than I realized," he said. I smiled faintly.
She planned for that. The fallout continued quietly after that. My father resigned from 2 boards. Settlements were renegotiated. Certain partnerships dissolved by mutual agreement. Nothing exploded, but everything shifted. And in those shifts, the truth became impossible to ignore. Meridian wasn't just an asset, it was a keystone, and without control of it, my father's dominance softened into something more human, more limited. As for me, I didn't rush into anything. I didn't spend recklessly. I didn't announce anything publicly. I stabilized, diversified, protected, built deliberately. Because the point had never been to win loudly. It was to never be cornered again. People started asking questions, carefully. What really happened? Was it as bad as they say? Are you okay? I answered honestly, yes and no, and yes. Months later, I visited my mother's grave. I hadn't gone since everything began. I stood there quietly, the wind brushing through the trees, and placed my hand against the stone. You knew, I whispered. She had. She'd seen what I couldn't yet articulate. She'd trusted that I'd grow into the weight of what she left me. Not just money, but choice. I thought back to that conference room, to the moment my father ordered me to sign, to the way he assumed obedience, and I smiled. Not because I'd beaten him, but because I'd outgrown him. The truth is, power doesn't belong to the loudest person in the room. It belongs to the one who knows when to stop asking for permission.
My father spent his life collecting leverage. My mother left me autonomy. And when the moment came to choose, I chose myself. That's how the story ends. Not with revenge, not with ruin, but with a woman who finally understood something simple and irreversible. No one gets to take what you refuse to sign away.